that I touched on this very slightly yesterday, but not at this level of detail, that I posted this morning over at HartmannReport.com, which is, by the way, free and no ads. The headline is, all the GOP has left is racism, and that's a lie, too. And in the 2020 election, you know, this last election, right, the Republicans didn't even publish a party platform. Mitch McConnell gave a speech to a group of fundraisers, fat Republican fat cats. There was a reporter there from Axios who said that McConnell said that, so one of the donors asked him, what are you going to run on? We know what you're opposed to. What are you going to run on? What is the positive message that Republicans are bringing Americans this year? And McConnell replied, Republicans should be 100% focused on Democrats and all the terrible things they're doing to this country. And then when he was pressed, well, won't you tell us at least what you're going to do? And McConnell said words to the effect of, well, when we get power again, we'll let you know. Right. So, this is like a bizarre parody of Seinfeld. I mean, the show that was about nothing. Now the Republican Party's about nothing. Nothing about getting the lead out of our water supply or the child brain-damaging pesticides out of our food. Nothing about strengthening Social Security or expanding Medicare to include glasses or hearing or teeth. Nothing about helping young families make it through those first tough 5 years with something like low-cost pre-K. Nothing about fixing the student debt crisis that's crippling 45 million Americans. Nothing about making health care or pharmaceuticals more available and affordable. Nothing about cleaning up our environment or stopping global warming. Nothing about turning our public schools back into the world's finest. I was in second grade, as I recall, maybe third, when Sputnik went up. And all of America held its breath for a minute as this Russian or this Soviet satellite was going bing, bing, but we watched it go through the sky. You could see it at night. And Eisenhower said, holy cow, we've got to raise a generation of scientists, and threw all kinds of money into our public schools. I was one of the beneficiaries of that. I was put in this advanced education program. And, and it was great. We had the best schools in the world from the 1950s until the mid-1980s, when Reagan's Secretary of Education, Bill Bennett, took a meat axe to that program. Nothing about giving working people better pay, raising the minimum wage, strengthening workplace protections. The Republicans had nothing about this, nothing about paid sick leave, nothing about family leave, nothing about rebuilding America's infrastructure that's been crumbling since Reagan's supply-side funding cuts back in the 80s. Nothing about getting high-speed, low-cost broadband into the homes of every American family to make America competitive and help with education. Nothing about taking on the corruption of politics by the dark money that the Supreme Court authorized with Citizens United. Nothing about making voting safe or easy or secure for every American. These are, by the way, all things that the citizens, or nearly all things that the citizens of every other developed democracy in the world take for granted. And the Republican Party addresses none of them. But there is one thing that the GOP is holding tight to their chest. This is what we love. They are giving it the biggest bear hug ever, and that is their belief in white racial superiority. Racism has been used to justify centuries of slavery. It was relabeled scientific racism in the 19th century and used to promote withholding medical care from black people. I wrote a book about, the first third of my book, The Hidden History of American Healthcare, is all about the story of Frederick Hoffman, who came to the United States in the 1880s or 1890s and became the vice president of the Prudential Insurance Company and fought Teddy Roosevelt's effort to bring us single-payer health care, Franklin Roosevelt's efforts to bring us single-payer health care, fought it tooth and nail and succeeded. And his rationale, black people shouldn't have health care because they're inferior and they will all die out if we just withhold health care. Honest to God, that was the argument he made, and it was the argument that America bought for 50 years. Racism has been used to, openly used by politicians to promote, this whole idea of scientific racism, to maintain legal racial segregation right up until the 1960s. Racism explains the Republican Party's embrace of the #2 guy in the Republican House caucus, Steve Scalise, who famously said, "I'm David Duke without the baggage." Racism explains Reagan's education secretary, Bill Bennett, saying, "If your sole purpose was to reduce crime, you could abort every black baby in this country and your crime rate would go down." Racism explains Republican defense of Confederate flags, statues, and names on military bases, and their supporters waving that traitorous flag while assaulting our democracy on January 6th at the U.S. Capitol. Racism explains Republican support for Trump banning immigration from bleep-hole countries, and how his campaign kickoff speech talking about Mexicans being rapists and murderers cemented his place in the Republican Party's primary. Racism explains why Republican appointees on the Supreme Court were so enthusiastic to gut the voting rights bill twice. Racism explains why the states that most supported Trump were also the states where the largest percentage of white citizens claim racial discrimination is a thing of the past or is now directed at white people. Racism also explains their Republican hysteria about quotas or their love of race neutrality or their constant complaining about what they call reverse discrimination. Racism describes their love of white supremacist militia and their embrace of both Nazi and Confederate iconography. Logos, you know. Racism explains why they're working so hard to prevent people from voting in largely black cities like or Hispanic like Atlanta, Houston, and Dallas. Racism explains why around 8 in 10 Republicans, compared with 40% of independents and 17% of Democrats, believe that killings of African Americans by police are isolated incidents. Racism is why Newsweek would report, quote, about half of white registered Republican voters in southern states say more attention needs to be given to discrimination against white people. Racism explains why, one after another, Republican-controlled states are trying to end the teaching of racial history in America in our public schools, the whole CRT hysteria. And racism explains Tucker Carlson's and the Klan's great replacement theory. And that racism not only works for them politically, but it's now being pushed on a whole new generation. There's these websites out there, are all kinds of them. The one that inspired Dylan Roof, the guy who murdered 9 people at the Emmanuel African Methodist Episcopal Church in downtown Charleston, South Carolina back in the day, was the Council of Conservative Christians, or Citizens, excuse me, which the Southern Poverty Law Center calls a white supremacist group. Republicans are constantly going to and giving speeches at the CCC, the Council of Conservative Christians, most recently Mississippi Republican Senator Roger Wicker. Dylan Roof, in his manifesto, wrote, "There were pages upon pages on the CCC website of these brutal black-on-white murders. I was in disbelief. At this moment, I realized that something was very wrong." This was his conversion experience, seeing this. And now the CCC has become the largest white supremacist group in the nation, according to The Atlantic, and, quote, CCC President Earl Holt III has donated some $65,000 to candidates in recent years, including GOP presidential hopefuls Ted Cruz, Rand Paul, and Rick Santorum. Holt's contribution reads like a list of who's who of conservative candidates in recent years. Before Dylan Roof murdered those 9 people at Emmanuel African Methodist Church, he proclaimed that black people have lower IQs, lower impulse control, and higher levels of testosterone. This brutally racist and demonstrably wrong sentiment or belief is not just one demented white guy, Dylan Roof. This is a core belief across the entire white base of the GOP and, or not the entire, but much of the base of the white base of the GOP, and across the militia movement, groups that are increasingly just melding together. It's literally this whole scientific racism thing is repeated today on millions of websites and social media groups. In my years on this planet, and there's been 7 decades on this planet, I've heard that lie over and over again. It's been, not so much in the last decade or so, but certainly when I was younger, I used to hear it, particularly when we lived in Atlanta. I would hear it from people, from customers of my business. It's incredible. It's there. The simple reality is that differences in skin color, hair color, or facial features have absolutely nothing to do with intellect or any other dimension of our shared humanity. We are all people under our skin. But they're still using this thing as a justification for segregation and redlining. The bell curve, remember that book? That was a big deal. I think it was in the 90s. All the Republicans were embracing it. That's been completely debunked, but his author is still praised by Republican politicians like Rand Paul, Jeb Bush, and Paul Ryan. The bottom line here is that white supremacy being promoted as pseudo-science, as it is right now on literally millions of websites all across the world, but certainly in the United States, is a lie. And the racist politics that flow from it are a poison in the bloodstream of our republic. It is literally killing us. It is tearing us apart. It is destroying our republic. And we need to wake the hell up from this 400-year-old lie and say, no, we are all people here. We are all people here.